just wait for Lynne to come on camera, but hi everybody. Welcome to our next webinar in the series that we're doing. Hi Lynne.
Hiya.
Hello. So following on from a saturated fat webinar that we did, it seems like a long time ago now, we did promise everybody we would follow up with something on ketogenic diets. So here we are doing exactly what we promised we said we would do. This is an incredibly popular topic at the moment, very, very hot in all the media, and we wanted to give our take on these types of diets. So my name's Chris, I am the head of healthcare at Heart UK, and I'm a registered nurse, and I'm joined by Lynne, and I think what is a new haircut.
Lockdown has come to an end.
So would you like to introduce yourself, Lynne, and then Alan, just about what you guys do?
Yeah, so my name's Lynne Garton. I'm dietetic advisor at Heart UK, and I've been a registered dietitian for now over 30 years.
Excellent. And Alan?
So my name is Alan Flanagan. I'm a postgraduate researcher at the University of Surrey, and I'm an associate registered nutritionist with the Association for Nutrition.
Fantastic. Thanks for joining us, guys. So just a little bit of housekeeping first. You should be able to see and hear us. We can't see or hear you, so whatever you need to do in the background, please do feel free. The Q&A function should be working, so if you see a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, if you've got any questions you want to put to the panel, please do. We've got a few questions that came through via email as well, which we're going to try to cover, but anything else you guys think of, please send those through to us and we'll have a look at them. Anything we can't answer on the webinar, we will follow up by email, and I'll give you all those details a bit later on. First thing to do, which I forgot to do last time, which is very important, which I want an idea from you guys who've joined us today. Thank you so much. Your level of knowledge on the effects of following a ketogenic diet on your actual cholesterol itself. So votes coming in thick and fast. You see that quite a lot of people, a bit like myself when we started to look at this topic, not sure and not that knowledgeable about it. Brilliant. No one's confessed to being very knowledgeable yet. That's interesting. So hopefully we can get some people bumped up to that level by the time we're finished. I'll give you guys a few more seconds. But for the most part, most of you said either not sure, not knowledgeable, or not knowledgeable at all. So thank you so much for voting on that, guys. We'll run that poll again at the end, and hopefully we'll see some really positive results. So I think what we'll kick off with first is just to acknowledge the number of inquiries that we get to our helpline about diet in general, but also specifically over the past year or so about the ketogenic diet. There's been quite a bit of concern amongst our experts and clinicians, what they're seeing with this diet. And I'm sure Lynne and Alan will cover this in a bit more detail, but we're seeing levels of LDL cholesterol, which is typically known as bad cholesterol, increase with people who follow those diets. So what we're going to do is first, we're going to talk about the actual foundation of what a keto diet is with Lynne, and then we'll start to delve into why we think we're seeing these trends of an increase in cholesterol coming. Obviously, we all know by now from our educational series of webinars, an increase in your cholesterol increase your risk of heart attacks, strokes, vascular dementia, and it's something we should all be really aware of. So Lynne, if you'd like to start giving us a bit of background to the actual keto diet itself.
Yeah, so the keto diet or the ketogenic diet is a diet that is extremely low in carbohydrate, around about 5 to 10% of calories from carbohydrate, or about 20 to 50 grams of carbohydrate a day. And if you cut down on one thing, you have to replace it with something else. And in this case, in the ketogenic diet, it's fat, with around 70 to 80% of calories coming from fat. Now, to put that into some sort of context with regards to carbohydrate, 2 slices of wholemeal bread contains about 28 grams of carbohydrate. A medium size apple contains about 20 grams of carbohydrate. So you can see these types of foods would be banned from the ketogenic diet. And the idea behind it is that if you cut, or if you have a diet very low in carbohydrates, you will not be using carbohydrates for your body's fuel, and it is the body's preferred source of fuel, and so you're forced to use fat for your energy. And this process also then produces ketones, and ketosis is when there is a buildup of ketones in the blood. And the idea behind, how it's come about, historically it has been used, and it still is used to treat certain things like epilepsy in children, but that is under very strict medical supervision. But more recently it's become quite popular as a means of losing weight, and it's been promoted in the management of type 2 diabetes, specifically for its weight loss. But somehow, and I don't know how this has happened, it's now coming across that this is seen as a general healthy type diet, and it's a superior type diet to weight loss. And there are different types of ketogenic diets out there if you look on the internet, but generally they ban all carbohydrate-rich food sources. So that's sugar and sugary foods, so your sweets, chocolates, cakes, biscuits, but also your starchy carbohydrates such as bread, rice, potatoes, other fiber-rich vegetables, but also things like most fruits and legumes and beans, and if you've cut out those, what are you replacing it with? And I said the sources of fat. So they will be, these diets allow sort of foods that are high in saturated fats, so butter, cream, cheese, things like coconut oil, as well as meat, and as well as things like the unsaturated fats, such as the nuts, seeds, oils, and oily fish. Our concern at Heart UK, along with the expert heart associations and lipid associations, is that these types of diets severely restrict or eliminate foods which we know are cardioprotective, such as whole grains, pulses, beans, fruits, vegetables, but at the same time they encourage foods which we know have an increased risk to heart disease, such as foods high in saturated fat. So I think it's a really good opportunity to talk about this, because there is a lot of confusion about the ketogenic diet.
I think it's just to sort of plug into what you said about conditions, and there are places for very special diets, but what people don't understand is the complexity of some of these conditions. So most people think they understand diabetes quite well, and I think we all have a bit of a handle on it. But as clinicians, we see the complexities that come with it and the very, very delicate balance that you have to address. And people who undertake these sorts of diets, when they're trying to deal with certain conditions or not, do so under medical supervision, and those are very strictly monitored, and they are monitored to ensure that that person is safe and well and healthy, and also to address those things that Lynne talked about, in that those people will still need an intake of fiber and essential fatty acids that come from good fat foods rather than all the bad fats, and the things they miss out on can be replaced. What we see a lot with people who follow these diets on their own, they do it as part of a group which doesn't include a registered expert under proper supervision, is they're following a diet which will put them at risk, and they're not getting some of the nutrients they need. So it sort of segues nicely into the evidence that sits behind the ketogenic diet, which Alan is going to take us through now in regards to things like weight loss, health benefits, and lipid management in general.
Yeah, I think as Lynne pointed out, it is important to stress, there is a difference between a clinical nutrition intervention that has clinical utility in a specific circumstance, and that is implemented by a team of clinicians, both medical and nutritional. And the ketogenic diet has been used effectively to that end in drug refractory epilepsy in children from the 1920s. So it's not a new diet. What's new is this surge in popularity in its everyday use, as Lynne pointed out. And I think that comes with a general trend in the last number of years, in nutrition to want to take quite a revisionist view on some aspects of diet history, essentially dietary history or history of our dietary guidelines. So you have a very vocal movement that questions the evidential basis upon which we first recommended reductions in saturated fat. They question the dietary guidelines that were introduced in the UK and in the US in the late 70s and early 80s, and they essentially try and blame those dietary guidelines for the subsequent increase in chronic lifestyle disease that we've had over this period. It's a imperceptibly reductionist and flat out incorrect view of history. And I think with that has come this kind of idea that, well, we were wrong about animal fats, we were wrong about saturated fats. And of course, this diet very much kind of celebrates these food sources and encourages their ad libitum consumption. And by ad libitum, I mean, without restriction. And so I think in that context, we do have a growing concern over its use. I'm going to leave aside the epilepsy and clinical nutrition utility for it in that context and discuss more of what we're seeing people try to use it now for, which is either diabetes management, weight loss generally, or now, people assuming that it's actually a beneficial step to take for cardiovascular health. There are a number of potential mechanisms through which the ketogenic diet has been suggested to benefit diabetes. Specifically, when we look at diabetes through a very kind of glucose-centric view, and we say, well, you eat carbohydrate, your blood sugar levels increase, your pancreas has to pump out insulin, you have to take down that blood sugar levels. And we've historically viewed diabetes through this kind of lens that eventually your failure to produce insulin and you're diagnosed as diabetic. So with the ketogenic diet, because carbohydrates are in effect removed, what you tend to see is profoundly low insulin levels. And so this hypothesis has been that, well, this is probably a good thing for diabetes management. And the hypothesis is extended to suggest that if you drop insulin levels very low, then you create more fat available for energy. And then you burn off that fat and you lose weight at a faster rate. So both of these two limbs, the drop in insulin being beneficial for diabetes and the enhanced fat oxidation or fat burning, to use the colloquial term that you would see, have been tested in a number of really rigorous metabolic ward studies, which are the tightest design of a study that we can get in nutrition. And what they've done in these studies is they've had people for 4 weeks with every morsel of food that they're eating controlled on a kind of typical diet of 50% carbohydrate, 15 to 20% protein, and the remainder to fat. And then they've switched them onto a ketogenic diet for 4 weeks. And what we know from these studies now is, one, a drop in insulin is not a prerequisite to enhanced weight loss. So you don't need to lower insulin to enhance weight loss. And we also know from other really well-conducted studies as well that the idea that a reduction in insulin per se is all you need for diabetes management is possibly an oversimplistic view. In fact, what we tend to see with diabetes now is massive fat accumulation in the liver that spills over into the pancreas. And when you reduce that visceral fat, and you are not necessarily too long after diagnosis, so within a short period of time, you can see a rejuvenation of the capacity of the pancreas to produce insulin. But that isn't related to lower insulin levels necessarily. That's related to reducing the amount of fat in the pancreas and in the liver. So the suggested mechanisms through which the ketogenic diet might benefit these particular conditions, either diabetes or just weight loss generally, doesn't really have any evidence for it at this point. The one thing I think that is worth saying that perhaps does still continue to underpin its popularity for weight loss alone, so not diabetes management, is, and there is some evidence to support this, there seems to be a profound reduction in appetite on a ketogenic diet. And historically or evolutionarily, the ketogenic diet is considered to have been somewhat a kind of starvation mode diet. It's our body kicking into survival using an alternate fuel source when we don't have external carbohydrates available in the diet. We've no really way of knowing whether that's true or not, but the suggestion is that there is a couple of metabolic effects of that may suppress appetite. So Lynne mentioned ketone bodies. There's a suggestion that when they elevate, then that they actually correlate to lower hunger levels. When you're consuming a lot of fat, it might impact on a gut hormone known as CCK as well. There's some evidence to suggest that that will kind of signal to the brain that you're full. So I think from a weight loss perspective, a lot of the popularity comes from people who have tried a lot of diets and failed and been hungry, and they adopt this dietary approach and they find themselves not hungry and for the first time are able to actually sustain weight loss. However, I think, again, it's important to separate out whether someone uses a diet for general weight loss in the short term versus the long term. Comparing, for example, a ketogenic diet to just a generally low carbohydrate diet, there's no difference. And we know actually for longer term studies that go over a year to 2 years, there's really not much of a difference at all between diets that vary in the amount of carbohydrate to fat in terms of weight loss. So there is a personal preference component, but there is certainly no unique advantage to a ketogenic diet in terms of weight loss. And if there is an appetite suppressing effect, that there's some evidence for that, but it's not concrete at this point. I think that the last thing to point out with the ketogenic diet is that although the popular iteration of it, that, if you Google it, you'll see, a ribeye cooked in a pound of butter, it is plausible to do a ketogenic diet, and you could do a ketogenic diet technically and still maintain saturated fat lower than 10% and have all of your fat coming from unsaturated fat sources and salmon, oily fish, nuts, seeds, and these foods that we generally consider cardioprotective. But within that, I think, and you will hear people who argue in favor of a ketogenic diet say, well, it's still possible to get fiber through nuts, avocado. The one caution that I think warrants, in that point is most of our evidence for fiber comes from foods like Lynne pointed out, like whole grains, legumes, these kind of foods. We don't really have that good data on how and whether fiber in fat foods is necessarily equivocal. The benefit for nuts, for example, for cardiovascular health might relate more to their phytosterol content. So I think bringing this all back around, although it's possible to do a ketogenic diet it would take a huge amount of planning and nutritional knowledge and awareness. Most people don't do it, certainly in my experience. Most people just use it as an excuse to essentially just eat bacon, butter, and base their diet around these foods, partly because they're also convinced by the rhetoric they hear that we were wrong to ever suggest removing these foods from the diet or certainly lowering them. And so for the most part, we see people eat diets that are very high in saturated fat. And I think if we're bringing this back to why most people are here, which is cardiovascular health, we've had a couple of nice studies looking specifically at more one of the criticisms ketogenic advocates will say is, oh, well, this study says it was a ketogenic diet, but actually it wasn't. They do have a point there. A lot of studies claim to be keto, but it's 50% fat and it's not quite high enough. We do have studies that have compared true ketogenic diets where saturated fat was around 30% of the 70% of fat that they were consuming. And LDL cholesterol, these are in normal, healthy BMI of 22 men who were between 22 and 24 years of age. So otherwise, in terms of a clean bill of health, and their LDL cholesterol went up on average by about 44%. And I think we need to really, be cautious with, the manner in which people do put this diet into practice. The kind of adulation in many respects of animal fat and saturated fat, and this encouragement to consume it as much as possible. I think from a cardiovascular health perspective, I can't see a reason why the diet will be recommended to someone for lipid management or for any other parameter of cardiovascular health.
A lot of very interesting points there. I think that one of the ones that interests me is that notion of potentially this being something where we're pushing the body into doing something we'd only have to do in an emergency, in a situation where, we need that emergency process in place. It comes in, but on a normal day-to-day basis, we shouldn't be in that mode. There is no need for our body to be under that kind of pressure to the point where it says you shouldn't be hungry. when actually being hungry is not a terrible thing sometimes. And then when you feed that hunger with a nice, healthy, balanced meal, you feel good afterwards and you want to do more. And I think that all feeds quite nicely into that. And that notion of understanding that if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. If a diet's telling you to eat tons and tons and tons of red meat without too much restriction, but if you don't eat bread and other carbs, then you'll be okay. It's probably not the diet to follow for you. It's, you know, anything too extreme. And like we said, diet's incredibly complicated when you look at the science, but from a charity perspective, from a health CVD perspective, we like to say that diet is actually quite straightforward. There are some very, very simple things and guides that you can follow. Try and be good roughly about 80% of the time. The other 20% of the time, have your wedding cake when you go to a celebration and enjoy those nice things that you do. Don't overcomplicate things. Because as we've seen, you know, with Alan and Lynne, this explanation of this very, very strict diet that if you follow it, you know, you'll lose weight, but you won't necessarily be healthy. And for the most part, you really do restrict what you can do is never going to end that well. There are various arguments that go backwards and forwards with. So we've talked a little bit about the changes we see in lipid profiles, specifically with LDL cholesterol, which is typically bad cholesterol. There's also other components of cholesterol like triglycerides and HDL, which is typically thought of as good cholesterol. So the argument that we sometimes see with a ketogenic diet is that although there's a rise in bad cholesterol, it's not harmful because the reduction you see in triglycerides and the increase you see in HDL is more important. I know the answer to the question, but I want to hear Alan's explanation of why this has come about and how we can address it.
I think it's come about as a red herring to distract people from the reality that LDL cholesterol causes atherosclerosis in all circumstances. Now, that doesn't mean that heart disease comes down to LDL cholesterol. And no one in cardiovascular sciences has ever made that argument. There are things going on. So, for example, it lowers their cholesterol levels and still has high triglycerides. They'll get extra benefit by reducing those triglycerides. There was a recent trial known as the Reduce It trial, which used high-dose fish oils to bring triglycerides down in patients who already had low LDL. And other factors like inflammation, for example, can leave someone with a residual risk. So if they've LDL, but they still have high HSC reactive protein, bringing that down is also going to give them additional benefit. So no one's ever argued that there aren't other factors in a very complex factorial disease process that is atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. But the idea that low triglycerides alone and high HDL negates elevated LDL cholesterol is just simply incorrect. And recently, I think it's important to stress that while there's been a lot of focus on HDL as the good cholesterol, one, there's no evidence that increasing HDL through pharmacological means actually benefits. Two, a lot of the focus recently in cardiovascular has really just moved away thinking about HDL in much of the picture at all. And so we're really always coming back to LDL. And I think we need to, you know, be kind of quite firm in stating that, yes, if you took two people with high LDL, same amount of LDL, and one had low triglycerides and high HDL, and the other had high triglycerides and low HDL, that latter person is going to have a higher cardiovascular risk. It doesn't mean the other person is not a risk at all. They're still a risk. They're just perhaps not as much a risk. So elevated LDL is causal in all circumstances, and that holds true in all circumstances. And I think we need to be quite firm in reaffirming that.
Absolutely. So counter arguments in regards to keto diet, so that we get a lot about the size of LDL particles as well. There's that we get that through the helpline quite a bit. So what is your stance on LDL particle size?
So particle size has received a lot of focus. But again, that's one of the things that the real emphasis on is somewhat waning. what we now understand, even as understanding of lipoprotein LPA is increasing as well, is that really, you know, with any of these LDL, LPA, we're talking about the cholesterol that they carry being deposited into arteries. So if you have large LDL, they have more capacity to carry more cholesterol. If you have lots of smaller, denser LDL, they don't carry as much cholesterol per particle, but there's more of them. Ultimately, the net amount of cholesterol that's deposited into the artery wall is roughly the same. So all LDL is atherogenic. The smaller particles are capable of penetrating the arterial space more, which is accepted. But the idea that there is a massive differentiation and that higher or larger LDL particles are not a risk is completely incorrect. All LDL particles are atherogenic, and if you've got a larger particle, it can deposit more cholesterol in the wall, and if you have a couple of smaller particles, they don't carry as much, but they deposit it all in there as well. So I think we need to, the particle size thing is relevant, particularly if someone has a lot of visceral adiposity. They might have small, dense LDL because they've, again, fat in the liver and stuff, and that is relevant to their clinical assessment, risk assessment, and treatment options available. The idea that large LDL does not pose a risk is completely incorrect.
In relation to LDL size and number, there was a study, the Hill study, that looked at plant-based low-fat diet decreases. Do you want to give us a little bit of some top-line findings of what that study showed us?
Which study was this?
The Hill study. Lynn, you're on mute.
So this was the a plant-based low-fat diet decreases energy intake compared to an animal-based ketogenic diet.
Oh, Kevin Hall's study.
Hall study.
Sorry,
my notes say Hill in my defense. They say Hill. So we're saying
Hill
study. We'll edit that out later, guys. So the Hall study, the plant-based.
Yes. Yeah, Kevin Hall's work in this area has been fantastic, and coming back to this idea of ketogenic diets being satiating and impacting on appetite, they may do that, but arguably there's a greater effect of diets that are very high in fiber, and that kind of lineage of evidence goes back to the 70s. And so that dietary intervention, again, metabolic ward, everyone lives in the study laboratory, they're fed exactly what they need every day. And in this study, the design was deliberately not going to restrict how much energy participants could eat. And what they found was that when participants were consuming the very high fiber, high carbohydrate, low fat diet, they spontaneously reduced their daily energy intake by around 600 calories a day. And one of the things that we have seen in some interventions that have used that type of diet is, so people talk about ketogenic diet for weight loss. Well, in some of the diets using these kind of, and by the way, these are diets using, up to 60 grams of fiber a day because they're so heavily focused on these carbohydrate food sources. There's been up to kind of 10, 12 kilos of weight loss over a year. So, I think from, that perspective that we certainly know that fiber is quite satiating. And I think that study gave a lot of plausibility to why we see a lot of weight loss in interventions where people consume that diet. And, if we're comparing an option for a dietary intervention for cardiovascular management, that would certainly be a much sounder option on multiple fronts, because we know that fiber isn't just satiating, but we know it has a direct effect on cholesterol recycling and lowering LDL cholesterol as well.
Absolutely. So thankfully, as part of all this, obviously, there is a lot of guidance out there from experts around not just diet in general, but also very specific guidance that we've got that helps to tell us, when it comes to lipid management, what do the experts think about these types of diets. So Lynne is going to take us through the expert consensus. So this is the opinions of people who specialize in this area, people who are experts in things like nutritional science. They understand nutritional research, which is a complete separate expertise of its own. Nobody who hasn't really studied nutritional research should not pretend to know how to interpret it. I certainly don't. I'm a nurse. I'm not a dietitian. So it's a very specific area to be very, very careful about how we interpret nutritional research. So Lynne, if you could give us the overall consensus, and then what we're going to do is dive into the many questions that we've had to come to the Q&A. Thank you so much for sending all those questions through, guys. We'll give you this summary consensus, do a quick poll, and then we'll start looking at your questions. So over to Lynne.
So I think Alan has so eloquently explained that actually there is no evidence that a ketogenic diet is going to help in lipid management, not the popular ketogenic diets that we see. And what we don't know, because there's been no long-term studies done, we don't know what the long-term effect on the ketogenic diet on cardiovascular risk is. And it does challenge all the current nutrition recommendations, whether it's from Public Health England, whether it's from NICE, the European Society of Cardiology, the European Atherosclerosis Society. It goes against all of their recommendations because, as we've mentioned, it encourages the consumption of foods which are associated with increased risk, and it eliminates or restricts foods that we know have cardioprotective benefits. And actually, due to the popularity of the ketogenic diet, the US Lipid Association Nutrition and Lifestyle Task Force recently examined the evidence for these types of diets on cardiovascular risk. And in their statement, they express concern for the ketogenic diet in patients who've got high cholesterol, and in particular people who have got familial hypercholesterolemia, and have said that these diets are contraindicated for these people with these conditions. So I think that's kind of like says it all, really, that we shouldn't be recommending these diets because of the high saturated fat content in them. And so it goes back to our advice. The cornerstone of our advice is still to kind of watch the amount of saturated fat you have in the diet, replace this with sources of unsaturated fat within the context of a heart-healthy diet that includes fiber, which includes whole grains, fruits, vegetables, and plant proteins.
Absolutely. So I'm going to quickly run the poll, the same poll that we did at the beginning. And let's see how many people now, thanks to the wonderful educational opportunity we provided, can say that they have increased their level of knowledge. Not expecting people to be experts, but this is hopefully giving you a really good foundation in how to understand this type of diet and where it should be used. There's a phenomenal number of people, more than 80% say they're now knowledgeable, 15% very knowledgeable. Fantastic. So we've done our bit. That's great. And thank you so much for voting, guys. I'll close the poll just there. So there's been a really great increase in the number of people that said they've got something from this webinar. So it's incredibly important for us to understand that we're doing the right thing. We're answering your questions. That takes us into the Q&A. There are 19 questions. We're not going to be able to answer all of them, but any that we don't answer, you will get a follow-up email. It usually comes out about 24 hours after the webinar finishes that says, thank you for joining. And there'll be an email address in there that you can drop your questions in. If you feel we haven't answered your question live in this session, we can follow up with you. So let's dive straight in. I'm going to answer one that's quite an easy one. Is the keto diet okay as you had a heart attack 8 months ago? No. Do not follow a high fat, especially high saturated fat diet if you are otherwise healthy, but especially if you've had something like a heart attack or a stroke. You should not be following this type of diet. It is not safe for you. and it could cause you some problems. If you've had a heart attack, you're probably on medications like statins. The idea of those is to lower your cholesterol. The last thing you want to do is to introduce more saturated fat into your diet to try and counteract the good work that that does. So that is an easy one, which is a good start. So that one's been sorted. There's a few questions in here about sort of saturated fat in general and the evidence that sits behind it. So what I will say is that there is an enormous body of evidence that sits behind the fact that saturated fat, as Alan said, can cause atherosclerosis, which is the buildup of fatty plaque in the arteries, which increase your risk of heart attack and strokes. There is a sort of movement out there of people who deny that this is true, but from our perspective, we've reviewed all of the available evidence, and we're very, very confident that, you know, we are given the right message that you can have saturated fat in your diet, you just can't have too much. It's all about balance. Any diet that advocates cutting out huge amounts of certain food groups completely are usually not the best way to go. We've had a few questions as well about people who try to follow or are following a ketogenic diet but are vegetarian, or they're vegan. So is there any kind of informational support we can give around that in regards to those types of diets? It's sort of an even narrower subsection of people that are ketogenic and almost plant-based.
If I maybe answer first, and then Alan, if you want to add, I think the concern that I would have with that is the nutritional quality of the diet, in terms of when you're cutting out all animal products, you replace it with other plant foods, and a lot of those might be pulses and foods which would be excluded on the vegan ketogenic diet. So whilst, and again, I don't know if any studies have actually been done on a vegan ketogenic diet, so that Alan's answering the question. Yeah, we don't know. We don't know what the evidence is. I think if somebody wanted to do that type of diet, they would need some real expertise. Somebody, they'd have the nutritional knowledge, as Alan's already mentioned, the nutritional knowledge. There's a lot of planning that would be required. So I would have concerns in somebody just trying to undertake this on their own without having some assistance by somebody who is qualified in nutrition.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think there's any net gain. I think it would be a better iteration of the ketogenic diet to be focusing on these types of fats. You would inevitably have to eat a lot of plant fats that we associate with health, and foods that we associate with health. But what would you be trying to achieve? The question to ask, what would you be trying to achieve by being in a state of ketosis? And there would be no real added benefit for an individual when they're already following a diet plan that is going to, a dietary pattern that is broadly conducive with, as long as it's not the vegan junk diet, presumably, but you know, so I don't see what additional benefit to someone's health would be gained in that circumstance.
Absolutely. So let me have a quick look here. We've got some other questions through. Question about palm oil and saturated fat. So yes, palm oil does contain saturated fat. Lynne, you could talk about the amounts of saturated fat between oil differ. So where does palm oil sit on that scale?
Yeah, so we actually have quite a lot of questions come through on the helpline regarding palm oil, because it is found in so many foods. Now, palm oil does contain saturated fat, and we know saturated fat increases cholesterol. Palm oil is also used for its functional properties in a lot of products. Now, some of those products we'd be advising to reduce on anyway, so things like cakes, chocolates, what have you, but they also get used in spreads and in some unsaturated spreads, specifically for its functional properties. Now, the thing to look at then is to look at the amount of saturated fat in the total content of the final product. Rather than just focusing on palm oil per se in that product, it's looking at the overall kind of balance of saturated to unsaturated fat. And I think, yes, there's the environmental aspects of palm oil, but on the other hand, what you've got to consider is that palm oil is a very high yielding palm is a very high yielding crop. It will produce a lot of oil per acre compared to another crop. So if products are going to use an oil, they're going to use palm oil, and if they were to use something else to try to get that functional property, it would maybe have a greater environmental impact. So we've got to, there's kind of like, it's this whole balancing, but I think the final product, it's about looking at the sort of the balance between the fats in that end product, not looking at necessarily the individual ingredients.
We've got a dietitian who's joined us, which is fantastic, who's kind of said, no, they would not recommend this diet to their patients, which is fantastic. But obviously, we do have people who come in and it is a personal choice. All we can do as healthcare professionals is explain what the risks are and the benefits of certain things. So if you had somebody, to put you on the spot, who came into you who was absolutely determined they were going to do this diet no matter what you said, is there a way that you could advise them to follow it as safely as possible, bearing in mind that there are still risks associated with that type of diet?
To me, I would again say probably including more of the unsaturated fats, including the oily fish. I would also, first of all, I think, is understanding why they wanted to do it. If it was for weight loss, I think it should be a short period of time. I would maybe discuss with the patient that it should be, let's look at it for doing a time restricted period, and then maybe gradually increasing the amount of carbohydrates to sort of get to a more balanced approach of eating.
I think if it's with a nutrition professional, because I think that question did come in from a dietitian. So it's not impossible to help someone on a ketogenic diet get around, 25 to 30 grams of fiber a day. So a nutrition professional will be able to do that. Now, you're being very anal with, amounts of nuts and seeds and avocado and stuff to try and get there. But I think that's worth, if someone was absolutely adamant, I'm going to do this, I think that would be worth under nutrition professional dietetic supervision and, giving them food-based recommendations to try and maintain, so they're not consuming the kind of 0 to 5 grams of fiber that some people often do on that diet, which is a bit ludicrous.
We're quite notoriously bad in this country for not getting enough fiber as it is. But then if people start to follow a diet like this, it's going to cut that even lower. And we know that fiber, getting enough in your diet, has some really good cardioprotective effects. So it's incredibly important. Again, it's not just about one single piece of nutrition component over another. It's not fat versus sugar versus fiber versus all of these things. It's everything together. And the reason that the guidance says that you can have a certain amount of each thing is because the balance is the key. We give that message out a lot. It doesn't sound particularly exciting, but it's the best thing that you can do. One of the other questions we get most commonly, and I never understood why, but we get a lot of questions about eggs. We have a blog about eggs. We have a page about eggs as well. But as part of this, we've had more questions about eggs, which I'd like Lynne to have a quick run through of where eggs fit into this sort of picture as a whole.
Well, I think, generally we say, eggs, historically it was very much, you've got to restrict eggs because of their cholesterol they contain. Now, we know now that it's not just about cholesterol. Actually, more important, we need to focus on the saturated fat. And it's when you have a lot of cholesterol and a lot of saturated fat in the diet, this is when it will increase the bad cholesterol. And I suppose with the ketogenic diet, actually that could be seen. You'd be having lots of foods in cholesterol and lots of foods high in saturated fat. And this is where eggs would then become potential, or high cholesterol containing foods such as eggs would be a problem. But generally speaking, as part of a heart healthy sort of balanced diet, eggs can be included into the diet. I don't know if, Alan, you've got any further comments on that.
No, that's perfect. Yeah, absolutely.
They're a great source of other things, a good source of protein and various vitamins and minerals. And for the most part, most people probably don't eat a huge number of eggs every single day for it to be a problem. So, please do continue to enjoy your eggs in moderation if you're a particular egg lover. So that's brought us to the end of our time. I'm so sorry. I know there's a lot more questions that people had. As I said, in the emails that you receive through Zoom from Heart UK, you can email us those questions that we've unfortunately not had time to answer, and we will get back to you over the next few days. All of our sessions are recorded, so if you want to come back to this and watch it again, you will receive a link with the email to come and view the webinar as it's recorded. It takes about a week usually to edit and upload, but all the rest of our previous webinars are uploaded if you want to watch any of those too. Thank you to everybody that joined us. Any healthcare professionals on the line, please do sign up to our free professional membership. We have a lot more nutritional webinars coming up this year and next year as part of our Nutrition Academy initiative. It's incredibly exciting. Lynn and I have done a lot of planning, and we're very, very proud of what we're going to do. So please do sign up if you're a professional, and look out in your inbox the rest of the webinars for this year and next as they come out. Thank you to Alan, thank you to Lynn so much for your time today and for doing this webinar with us, and we'll see you all very soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank
Have
you.
a nice day. Bye-bye.
Take care.